And I want to talk about the story that's sort of the Bible story, maybe most often associated with this. This is the one where maybe people's immediate thoughts of, oh, it's a book on homelessness, you're going to do some Christian reflection on it. Obviously, you're going to talk about the nativity, right? You know, Jesus is born in the manger because there's no room at the inn, right? Literally, you know, they go to seek housing. They're told, no,
Yeah.
you're too late. You
There's
know,
no booking.com.
no booking.com, you're a dollar short, as
Yeah.
we would say where I'm from. There's a bus shelter out back, basically, right? With some stinky animals
Yeah.
in it. You're welcome to that, unless you want to go look for, the nearest churchyard or whatever, but no tent, no sleeping bag, no thing. So I guess let's just start with the kind of obvious question, which is based on what you do, based on your experience of those 14 nights. How do you read the nativity story differently now? Or how are you struck that you read that story perhaps differently from people who've never thought long and hard about the experience of street homelessness?
The first thing is this is systematic. There's no need for them to have to travel all that way, apart from somebody deciding there should be a census. Right? This is a community-created homelessness, and actually most homelessness is in that way. Out on the street and walking back from Grenoside, I was raging in my head about the politics, and I write in there particularly about this argument we have about the size of government. Government shouldn't be too big, and yet if it's failing children, if our children don't have in this G7 country options within education, if we don't have good access to healthcare and all of those sorts of things, then we're not quite big enough, it seems to me. And most homelessness is coming out of some of those issues that are systematic. And that's the first thing. Good old Quirinius, we don't know anything about him, but he creates a system which leads to this family being homeless and vulnerable. She's heavily pregnant on that journey. We put this family through and this woman through, and again, it's we laugh about the fact I talk about the loo in there. Practical things. How do you get practical things? I can't imagine what she needed on that journey. I really can't. No wonder Joseph always looks haggard in pictures of him. That journey was enough. Just trying to care for her and carry that responsibility. But of course, the other thing that I find really, really interesting is the people who wanted to visit me most on my 14 days were people who had experienced homelessness and came. There were others, there were friends and people, supporters of the project. And it's really interesting that Luke tells this story of the fact that this great news doesn't break into the upper class of society. And it's celebrated, light is celebrated within the group of shepherds. We have this, quite wonderful picture of the angels from heaven with what we understand is the most basic employment we could find for those people who couldn't get into employment, coming together. And they go and celebrate, they go and visit, are surprised to be welcomed there, I guess. But the joy, of course, is there is a manger there is somewhere for them, whether it's straw, it's not a bed, it's below basic, but there is somewhere for them.
So part of my reflection on this, part of the original motivation for me wanting to have this conversation with you is, I shared with you some of my work is thinking about the experience of migration and the Bible. And Advent is the period where all of a sudden the rhetoric will explode, helpfully in some ways, about the idea that Jesus was a refugee. So part of it is this story, but of course then what happens is Herod finds out this baby who, was born in a little shelter out back, turns out to not be just a little boy in the shelter out back. He turns out to be this really, really important child with this big threat. And so the Holy Family flees into Egypt. Now part of that story is it's interesting. It's making, you talked about the exile earlier, it's making Jesus kind of go through this experience of being like the people of the Exodus. He has to go to Egypt and then eventually come back. And so there's this whole thing about Jesus was a refugee. And I'm actually immensely thankful for that kind of rhetoric and that kind of language, because as someone who's a migrant myself, has had to deal with the systems and the institutions in this country and other countries regarding that, we need promotion and visibility into that experience, what people are talking about. But I always feel that it's a bit flawed, and your reflections on kind of homelessness bring this out for me, because so Jesus is a refugee, he goes to Egypt, then he comes back, but then he lives the rest of his life. And so what's the majority of Jesus's life? Well, it's foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I mean, he lives this itinerant life where he looks an awful lot more like, sometimes I've described it as being more like Romani or Gypsy, right? Maybe a small community that travels around together, just kind of on the margins of society. Or actually the thing that I was struck with as I was reading your book, if I was coming up with a sort of 21st century equivalent for this, maybe what I'd come up with is Jesus is kind of a couch surfer.
Yeah.
So what do you do if we say, look, there's something helpful and important about that framing of Jesus as a refugee and that experience? We have so many people who are displaced by war and natural disaster and famine and climate and all that. And that is part of that experience that Jesus has. But actually, if we look at his life, actually he resembles some of these people as much or more. I mean, should we, 4 weeks out of the year, maybe we wear the Jesus was a refugee t-shirt, but the other, 58 or 48 weeks out of the year, Jesus was a couch surfer. Jesus was homeless. Yeah. I mean, what do we do with that?
Wow, what do we do with that? I mean, part of the thing I loved about 14 days, but also my time in the project, is that ultimately I come away enriched by the experience of working with that group of people. I'm enriched by the experience of going through the 14 days. And there's a sense of reality. We look at Carrie's story again of everything she experienced, and expect her to sort of cope with that magically. Of course, she doesn't. But the people who look at her and understand what she's going through the most are women who have walked that way before and shared that journey. And I can work with Carrie, I can understand her, I can listen to her story. I can't support her in the way that those others can, because they can spot things that I can't. I think there's something really rich in all sorts of ways about this itinerant life that Jesus leads, partly because I don't think it's as common as people think it is in biblical times. I think people do stay in their communities. So this is a person who goes out to stay with others, to share with others, to form groups of community in which there's a level of self-reliance. The big difference, of course, is that Jesus going out and living that lifestyle actually brings purpose and meaning. Many of the people who are living on the street are coping with today, and meaning and purpose is put on the back burner until something happens that allows them to look at meaning and purpose. But when they do, with James, with Chris, with Andrea, with those people who shared, who told us their story, with Joe, they're able to communicate to a group of people. They're able to give pathways, open doors, to allow green shoots to grow because of that experience that they've shared, and are now looking in a different direction, in a sense, to build and to enjoy and to understand fulfillment. And some of those stories are really, really Andrea's. You know, in some ways it looks a nothing story when she talks about being able to emerge from the wall that she tried to hide in. You know, cap down, nobody sees me. But then coming in purposely, way before a shift, you know, to talk with people, to sit and to be with people. That's when we see light and salt coming out of that experience. She's going a different way. She's not going back into that life. She knows that. She's firm enough. Not everybody is, but she is. But what she's able to do is just wonderful.
Yeah. So one of the big things that I took away from reading this book and in this context is, so some of the work that I've done earlier about migration, I mean, I have a certain understanding of that as someone who now does live in another country, and I'm the sort of third generation in a row in my family that's a migrant, so apparently it's a habit. But one of the things that I learned was my experience of migration wasn't quite the experience of migration that these things in the Bible were often talking about. And one of the deep senses that I had initially listening to you talk about the project, and then the 14 Nights Sleep Out, and then reading the book, was how much I have to learn from these people that you name, you know, Chris and Kara and Richard and people have had that experience. Because the more that I recognize how fundamentally different Jesus' experience was from mine, how fundamentally different so many of the experiences of the people that I encounter when I read the biblical text are from mine. How, you know, Jesus seems to have this kind of couch surfing-like lifestyle. You know, Paul talks to him about himself. You know, he migrates from city to city, and a tent maker never really quite has a home, and he, you know, keeps ending up in and out of prison and all this. That actually, there's a huge amount about those experiences I could learn from talking with and engaging with people who've had this experience that I could never comprehend, that you begin to get some glimpse of, that if I position them not as just a person who might be in need of some help or who might benefit from some sort of donation or care or whatever, and I reposition them as a thoughtful human being with lived experience that can change my understanding, not just of my life and of my society, but of these texts, because there's a real lived experience there that will pick up things, that will see things in these stories, that will say, have you ever considered that Jesus might be saying this? Or that story might be about that. And push me beyond my comfort zone, push me, the person who spent way too many hours and way too many pounds, getting highly educated about the ancient world, to just see things differently and all of a sudden have a door open up on what these texts might mean and how I might understand them. I was just convinced over and over again reading these stories, I'd love to sit down and talk with these people. I'd love to sit down and have that conversation and say, sorry, I don't mean to bug you, but could we read this text? Could you tell me what you get out of that? And so not to make you feel bad, but you're a bit of a proxy for some of those other discussions I hope I'll get to have at a moment. But just asking you to reflect on how the 14 nights changes your experience, helps you to read those texts, for me is a bit about that experience of saying, these are people that we would typically exclude from that kind of discussion, because we'd say, what could they possibly know that I don't know? And the more I think about this, and as my study of these things goes on, the more I think they know things I could never possibly bring to a conversation, that are in ways so much more fundamental to us trying to understand what this thing that we call the Bible is and what it might be challenging us to do. They're a wealth of knowledge.
There is. And of course there is no shortcut but to have the conversations with people. But if I just reflect on some of those conversations, because I was walking on the streets and living on the streets, I realised I asked different questions of people at different times. The funny one, the classical one for me was, saying with this I think the three women there, I'm a 57-year-old bloke with a bit of IBF, wondering about how close I needed to be. I wore all these clothes, my bladder isn't as good as it used to be in terms of its stop valve and all those sorts of things, and getting down to life's basics. And Amy, who just, retorted with, well, you're lucky I've got a 3 pregnancy bladder, or whatever it was, And then from that conversation, we talked about and the experience of abusive relationships and how that casts you out, and mentally how it casts you out and takes you into a place where you live a lifestyle which later you look back on and you think, was that really me? Now, within that situation, then we hear of somebody who thought they were living life really well, it went wrong, they had to cope with it suddenly, they did cope with it, they survived, but they went through this period of time when they just don't recognise themselves, and they've learned from that and grown from that and moved on. And in that moving on, this is where we have the wealth of compassion and understanding and learning about acceptance, learning how we individually cope with resentment, bitterness, sense of loss, and somehow package all those things well enough to be able to get on with life and contribute and find joy and pleasure and things like that. Now, isn't that just a fantastic, rich experience? Because there's nobody in this world who doesn't suddenly come across something that floors them emotionally or intellectually or whatever. But the beauty about these conversations is they're so diverse that I don't know how they cannot change our understanding of compassion. Chris, he's spoken about it publicly. recovering from his own homelessness and learning about trauma and in therapy, realised some memories that he'd sort of blocked away, including having a gun held to his head, which I think probably had nothing in it, but the parental figure behind it who said, you know, next time there'll be a bullet. And this is a child coping with that sort of experience. He understands something about how to reach out, or he runs away and his life goes downhill forever. But actually, once he's got control of that life again, he understands something about compassion. So has it changed, you know, how does that change me? And fundamentally, it means I have to listen a little bit more. And I have a difference of opinion, for instance, with Chris over how we respond to people who are asking for money on the street. And he comes from it from a person who sat there and knowing that without his fix on a day, he can't operate. I come from it, not from the point of view that somebody's going to take that money and spend it on alcohol. I think that's immaterial. There's an illness there. The illness has to be met. That's going to be met some way or other. I come from it, from seeing somebody die or being there where somebody has died because they've had to spend all day begging and not receive the medical treatment that they so desperately needed. Somewhere in there, when we bring those together, then there are some rich questions about, okay, well, how do we do this differently?